The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
I would like to spend a minute or two this evening reviewing where we have come so that as we move forward to the future, those of you who are here from week to week may get some idea of where we are going in relationship to where we have been. You will recall that the initial problem which I said at the beginning of these lectures was the question of what kind of identity can the Jew have in the modern democratic industrial world where he no longer lives in social and geographic isolation, where he no longer maintains an autonomous Jewish community structure, where he's no longer an isolated group which has status as a group in terms of the larger society. And during the Middle Ages, this group status for Jews was clear. It may have been unpleasant, it may have been undesirable from our point of view, but it was perfectly clear. There was no ambivalence concerning it. When the Jew came into modern society, he came into modern society not as a community, but as a series of individuals. That is to say, if an individual citizen in the contemporary society wishes to have a private religion, or if he wishes to take part in certain other cultural activities, he may do so. But he is not part of a larger group under normal circumstances, which has definite status within the community, unless it's a cultural group or a religious group of some kind. There are no separate nations within the nation, a subject which we will return to since it's the theme of the evening. Now, this was the crisis which precipitated the question of what it meant to be a Jew in modern times. To be a Jew in medieval times meant to be a member of that community, which was rather clearly defined, and in which one could place oneself as far as the society was concerned without difficulty. Now, in Western Europe, we saw that two major movements took place. In the first place, there was the movement to solve the problem by assimilating to the general culture, since one was now released from the compulsion of being a member of the Jewish group. One could become a member of general society, and if one became a member of general society, one had all the great cultural gains which were to be found in contemporary Western society. So many Jews, by the thousands, literally, converted to Christianity and shared in modern culture. A second answer was, in this case, one which I have not mentioned terribly much to you, but which I'd like to mention since I'm going to contrast it with Eastern Europe in a moment, was an answer which said the Jews ought to educate themselves. You may recall in discussing Moses Mendelssohn, I mentioned to you that he did a famous translation of the Bible, which made the Bible, the Torah, available to the Jewish community of Germany in a German form, in Hebrew letters, but German form. And this became the means then of educating them to modern and contemporary problems. And there was some Hebrew writing at that period too, which was a kind of a German Haskalah, an enlightenment, an effort to bring the Jews up to date in matters of art and literature and science and the rest, so they could share in Western culture. And finally, there was that third great movement in its various branches, which said, namely, the identity of the Jews in modern times is to be primarily a religious group. Our modern nations, our modern states, permit religious groups. A person can belong to any one of a number of religious groups and still be a member of the state, a full citizen, have his political rights, his economic opportunity, theoretically, and all the rest. Religion is a private matter. The state doesn't care. It may have certain concerns with religion, but as far as it's concerned, if you wish to belong to a religion, that's your business. There was no conflict between full citizenship and religious affiliation. And this became the major direction which the Western Jews took. First, it was a reform movement which sought to bring modernity into Jewish life, which sought to adapt the traditional Jewish life to a new aesthetic and even intellectual pattern. And then it was an orthodox reaction against the reform, which said that the tradition has a certain theory behind it, which one should really accept in order to really be a Jew. And finally, it was a conservative reaction against the two of them, which said that Judaism is both progress and tradition, or as the new book of Conservative Jewish Essays puts it, tradition and change. Now, these were the Western European answers to what it meant to be a Jew in modern times. By and large, they come down finally to the question, if you're going to be a Jew, you're going to be a Jew by religion. Now, for various reasons, that was not the answer given in Central and Eastern Europe. For various reasons, the religious answer never became a practical or feasible one for the Jews of Central and Eastern Europe. To the contrary, their answer took a different form. Now, it's interesting to see how similar kinds of answers took place in Eastern and Central Europe to what took place in Western Europe. In the first place, there were the assimilation movements of Central and Eastern Europe. One should not forget these assimilation movements. There were two of them, one negative and one positive. The negative one was socialist assimilation. Namely, by becoming socialists, we will free the Jewish people from the special economic and political situation in which it finds itself. There will be a universal harmony of mankind when all the goods are shared, when there are no special needs and problems, and as a result, the Jewish problem will be ended. The Jewish problem is solved by a universal humanitarian sharing, which makes it no longer necessary to have a special and unique Jewish group, and in which the Jewish group has all the benefits that all the rest of mankind has. That's assimilation. That says we will give up Jewish identity in order to acquire those universal human rights which all men want. And there's no reason for having Jewish identity when all mankind shares the values that once Judaism shared or preached and proclaimed, but now that socialism puts in practical and positive form and which can be realized. There was a second assimilatory movement for the Jews, and that was, in effect, the Haskalah movement, the famous Haskalah of Central and Eastern Europe. Now, it wasn't quite as assimilatory as the socialist movement, because at least what it was trying to accomplish, it sought to accomplish through Jewish means. I mean by that through the use of the Hebrew language. Whether in the early days of the Haskalah it was hoped that somehow the Jews could forever go on using their language and forever go on being a separate Jewish national group, some kind of notion of spiritual nationality seems to be inherent in many of the early Haskalah writers. Their major effort was to bring the Jewish group up to date, to have them modern, to let them read novels. Today, you know, the whole cry about the importance of reading a novel as compared to the Mishnah and the Talmud seems just a little bit somehow so to read some of the modern novels that we have around, it might be better off reading the Mishnah and the Talmud. But this was the whole beauty. The whole cry was, we are deprived. We want to get out to nature. Jews don't know anything about nature. They don't know about the great out of doors, about what life is really like. And the cry was to make Jews like everybody else in experiencing the full range and gamut of human emotion and experience, not limiting them to the classical books and texts. Now that's a kind of assimilation too. It says we really ought to be like everybody else, and we ought to set our standards by the intellectual and cultural standards of the world about us, and it would be very helpful if we did so. However, there was this positive element involved, the positive element of the Hebrew language as the instrument, and this kind of unwritten and sometimes written assumption of the nationality, the peculiar group ethos of what it meant to be a Jew. Now, the great positive answer of the Eastern European and Central European Jew, even though it was a Western European Jew who gave the focus to the movement, was Zionism. The movement which said all the things that we have been tracing in the last few weeks, which said, in effect, that the Jews are a nation. We are a nation like all the other nations of the universe. The only trouble is that during the course of our history we have been sidetracked. We have been sidetracked, and as a result we are a peculiar nation among the nations. That's why people hate us. And what we need to do is to become a nation again like all the other nations. Not take our rights from somebody else, but give ourselves our rights. We need to establish ourselves on our own land, use our own language, and according to some of the Zionists, live up to that national ideal, that national personality, that unique Jewish character which inheres in the Jewish nation. Now, this is a positive answer. It's a positive in terms of Jewish identity. We're going to remain Jews. Not only going to remain Jews, but by virtue of our definition of Judaism, we'll do something about it. It's going to be a Jewish thing. And what more Jewish could you really think of doing than bringing the language of the Bible back into the possession of the common folk, making it possible for every child who grows up to read the Bible as his native book, as the basic constitution of his folk. Really, what more positively Jewish could one do? Now, at this point, I wish to make a radical statement, which I think we need to carry us on into the transition. In a way, both the positive answers are not true to the tradition. These are the two major answers we have. In the West, Reform Judaism, and in the East, Zionism. For 2,000 years, the Jews weren't essentially a nation. Or if they were, their nationality was so assimilated to their religious being that a normal human being would call them a religion or a religious group, a somewhat peculiar religious group, to be sure, but that's what they were. On the other hand, the kind of religious group that they were is not quite what the Reform Jews made out of them, or even the conservative and Orthodox Jews in the early days of Germany, namely a kind of a creedal affirmation. Religion had, for those 2,000 years, at least, if not before then, had certain expressions and elements of community and folk and land and language which you don't normally think of as some kind of a Protestant sect, as some kind of a form of belief. In a way, both the reforms of Judaism, I mean by that Reform Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, and Conservative Judaism, which from my point of view are all Reform, small r, movements in Judaism. These movements are as much a change from the Jewish tradition as is Zionism a change from the Jewish tradition. Neither of them can claim, I think, to be the real, authentic inheritor of the tradition. Let's be honest. They have both changed what was before. They had to in order to survive. And in a way, though both of them are positive, they are both assimilationist movements. They both have to take on something of the character of the non-Jewish Christian world in which the Jew of the West found himself in order to survive. On the one hand, the Western Jews picked up the notion of religion and have transformed Judaism into a certain religious point of view. And the Jews of Central and Eastern Europe have assimilated Judaism to the notion of what it meant to be a nation. And in the kind of nation all the other nations were. They're trying to be a nation like all the other nations, like the Poles and the Germans and the French and the Spanish and the Italians. In other words, they're trying to be a nation in the same way that all the Christian nations have been nations. This is also assimilation. Whether you assimilate toward a religious idea or you assimilate to a political idea, in my opinion, the same factor is at work. It is an effort to find an acceptable definition in modern terms. And I don't think we can help ourselves. I don't think it's bad. I just want to point it out. I want to point it out because I don't think one has a right to point to the other and say, we're the real Jews. We are all changed, just as other Jews in other times and places have had to change the character of Jewish identity. This has happened before. The Jews were nomads before they settled in Palestine. In Palestine, they settled and became agriculturalists. After a while, they became urban dwellers. That brought about a change. They were a loose confederation of tribes. They became a monarchy. That was a change. The monarchy was destroyed, and they lived as part of a larger empire. That was a change. They were taken off the land and lived as autonomous communities in Babylonia, where they all lived together. That was a change. They were separated into small, isolated segments all around the Mediterranean world, although with some kind of a spiritual center in Spain. That was a change. Polish Jewish life was a change. It's been a change. Period after period. Epoch after epoch. And we should face the fact Jewish life has had to change. And this should lead you to certain conclusions. A, you can't go home again. The nostalgia and the longing and the hoping and the sighing for what used to be is very nice, but you can't have it anymore. The world has changed, and the very effort of certain small groups to try to relive the old Judaism is proof that you can't do it. The very fact that you have to have certain small, fanatical, isolated sects living the old life is proof that for the vast majority of the people, the old Judaism can no longer serve in modern times. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, when you recognize the change that we have had to undergo, perhaps the confusion in which we now are will not seem so bad. I say that only because other Jews have been through this before. We're not the only ones. It's true to us, our problems seem tremendous and difficult and overwhelming and impossible, but Jews have been through this before. I admit they've never been through quite this problem, because if they had, we'd take their answers and we'd apply it. Unfortunately, the trouble with having a living problem is it's a living problem. I mean, it really is a problem. Sometimes when I am asked to appear as an expert someplace to speak on a subject in which people have been cajoled into thinking that I am an expert, they come with a problem and they say, we have a problem and this is our problem. And what is your answer? And most of the time I have to say, if not to them, to myself, look, if I had an answer, it wouldn't be a problem. Because I tell everybody and they go solve it. The reason a problem is because you don't know the answer. This is a problem. It's a real problem. And this is the third point. We are still in the middle of it. We have not yet come to the solution. We don't quite know what the answer is. We still stand today, as you shall see in what remains of this series of lectures, we still stand today between these two major answers. The Zionist answer, which says the way to live as a Jew in the modern world is to go to the Jewish state and live there. And the religious answer, which says, if you want to go to the Jewish state and live as a Jew there, fine. But just living there as part of the Jewish state may make you an Israeli, it may not make you a Jew. To be sure, there's a good chance of being a Jew in the state of Israel, but it's not absolutely certain. On the other hand, if what really makes one a Jew is participating somehow in the religious relationship, which is what creates the Jew, then that relationship can be carried out almost any place. Now, these are the two major answers which still remain for us. And I want to define them for you because before we go on, I want to indicate to you that there was at least one other alternative which would be very appealing if we had it today, but which, for reasons I shall disclose, I do not think still applies. There was one alternative, major alternative, which arose in Central and Eastern Europe, which has a certain kind This answer has a certain kind of appeal to Jews who don't want to be religious, but who also don't want to live in the state of Israel. And it creates one of the major questions of our time, at least as far as Jews who live outside the state of Israel are concerned. Now, let me see if I can trace back for you the alternatives to Zionism on behalf of the Central and Eastern European Jews. Because these are the people who might have possibly found another alternative that could have been of interest to all of us, since most of us are descended from Central and Eastern European Jews, and by and large objections that existed to the early religious definition of Judaism have come from those of us who have shared that milieu 1 or 2 generations removed. In order to do that, I have to take you back to Herzl and the Zionist Congress. I have to take you back to the alternatives to Zionism, which were created first within and then without the Zionist movement. Half of the reason I'm doing this is because I couldn't quite pass it by without mentioning it. The other half is because I do think that one of them has some meaning for our time. I believe it was the Zionist Congress of 1904 that Herzl came in with an electrifying announcement. It had been clear that since the founding of the first Zionist Congress, Herzl had been chasing from a minister of state to another minister of state and trying to get interviews with this one and that one, and had in a large measure succeeded. And one of the things that kept the Zionist movement alive was the fact that here was the Zionist movement with international recognition. Not international recognition in an official way. No one had yet given a document or a statement. This wasn't to come until the Balfour Declaration of 1917. But at least Herzl was meeting with these people. There was a real representative of the Jewish people, and they seemed to be taking him fairly seriously. Herzl came into the Zionist Congress of 1904, I think it was, and he had an electrifying announcement. His announcement was that the British government had offered to the Zionist movement, and if it wasn't an official offer and it wasn't a full and firm offer, at least it was enough of an offer to indicate that the Zionist movement should take action on it, had offered them a piece of land on which to establish a Jewish state. It was in a section of Africa known as Uganda. Strange how a certain name can have implications in Jewish history. A name like Auschwitz, to be distinguished from Uganda, will have a permanent place in Jewish history. A city with which Jews would normally have had no concern and no interest and no desire. This name will mean something in Jewish history. A city, therefore, or a place rather, like Uganda, will have a permanent place in Jewish history. No Jew, well, that's impossible to believe that no Jew will ever get there, but no substantial number of Jews may ever settle in Uganda. Uganda will have a permanent place in Jewish history. Why? Because Herzl walked in and he said, look, you want to establish a Jewish state? We've got a place for it. Here in North Africa, the British government says there's a large section of land. The climate is rather temperate, very much like it is in Europe. The natural resources are rather great. The place is empty of settlers. You don't have any Arab-Israeli problem. There may be a few natives around, but they're not in such large numbers to really object. This is the kind of thing that can be settled fairly readily, we think. Would you be interested in Uganda? Now, can you imagine the effect upon the Zionist Congress? In the first place, this is official recognition that the Jews are a people, that they are entitled to international consideration, that they are really a subject to be concerned in a legal and an official way. Doesn't mean very much to you. You're used to being treated as a citizen with equal rights. But to people who aren't, to people, the Jewish people, which hadn't had anything of this kind of understanding, this was a fantastic moment. Uganda has a place in Jewish history as the first real recognition of Jewish national rights in modern times. But that's not why I tell you the story. When Herzl came into the movement, the Congress, it was already clear that there was going to be trouble over this proposal. It's interesting in what form it was submitted. You can always tell when something is going to run in trouble by the parliamentary form in which it is introduced. The parliamentary form in which this was introduced to the World Zionist Congress was that a committee should be appointed to investigate. Now, if you have a resolution which says that we go on record as approving, then you see you are already dealing with a statement of an official body, etc., and people can rise on the floor and say, we don't have the facts. So you can't really do that. You have to be pretty sure of yourself to bring in a resolution going on record as approving, although the Jews are dying for a state. We've got to get these Jews out of Central and Eastern Europe. We're going to have pogroms very shortly. This is the time of the Kishinev pogrom, and this is the time of the whole reactionary movement since the 90s and the turn of the century in Russia. We've got to get those Jews out. There are millions of Jews. They want to take them to Uganda. Remember, that was Herzl's plan. You take them en masse, you establish the state through a Jewish company, and this was legally guaranteed, the international recognitions that Herzl wanted. So he brought in a motion that a committee be appointed. Now, how can you be against a committee to investigate something? You're not in favor yet. No one is saying you should be in favor or against. They're just saying, let's look into it. What could be safer than such a motion? But it's interesting what happened at the World Zionist Congress. A critical, basic division of opinion took place, where a body of Russian delegates primarily, among whom Chaim Weizmann was one, he describes in his biography the mood and the moment. The vote was taken, and the decision to appoint a committee was passed. Not by a tremendous majority, was passed. Whereupon the Russian delegates, for whom everybody was doing this, got up and walked out. Why? Because a basic moment had come. You recall that one of Herzl's problems was that Herzl was a man without the deep Jewish orientation and background. He wanted a Jewish state to solve the Jewish problem. But where, he didn't particularly say. At that moment, the die was cast. When the Russian delegates walked out, when it became clear that if the Uganda Committee was ever appointed, the Zionist movement would split down the middle, and the real basic fundamental resource upon which the movement counted would be cut off, the issue was in effect decided. And what had they demonstrated? They had demonstrated something that Ahad Ha'am had known, but that Herzl hadn't known, namely, that Zion is found in Palestine. A movement like Zionism can only find its fulfillment in the land of Israel. Now, this is the famous part of the story. This is the part of the story that everybody knows, that the Zionist movement was from that time on irrevocably committed to Palestine as the place of the homeland and the state and the rest, and there was no turning back. It demonstrated something about the will of the people. The will of the Jewish people in modern times was to settle in Palestine as the place for the Jewish state. Now, why do I mention that? I mention that because there were some people who voted for the resolution that believed it. And although we don't often hear of them, they went out and started an organization of their own. They gave another definition of what it might mean to be a Jew in modern times, which has had a very interesting history, even though it hasn't worked out terribly well. I have to mention it to you. These people go by the name of the Territorialists. They wanted a territory, any territory, Uganda, any place else. And perhaps the chief among them was Israel Zangwill, the famous British short story writer and critic and the rest, who had been a Zionist, but one who didn't think that it was very important whether the Jews took Palestine or Argentina or any other suitable place. And he founded a movement to get Jews to get a territory and settle there. Now, this movement never amounted to very much Jewish-wise. It published a newspaper, and I think there is a newspaper which is its later succession, a magazine which is still published on the subject. Why cause all the trouble in Palestine? Why not take a section of the world where nobody is living? Everything that you could have in Palestine you could have there, and so on and so forth. By and large, the Jewish people did not pay much attention to it. So it's interesting that the Jewish people itself gave its answer to this. But the reason I mention it to you is that again and again, in relationship to the so-called Palestine problem, the question of settling the Jews in an uninhabited place has come up again and again. As if, why go into Palestine and crowd in there and cause trouble with the Arabs? Find some place where nobody is living and go settle there. And there have been a very interesting history of efforts to settle Jews in differing places. And the important thing to note is that they have all ended in failure. The effort to settle Jews in uninhabited or poorly inhabited places as a substitute for Palestine has never worked out. The famous examples are the efforts of Baron de Hirsch to settle Jews in Argentina. He was also interested, as the Zionists were, in having a normal Jewish economic distribution. He wanted them to become farmers. He had farming schools and set it up for them, and he took them to Argentina. This was even before the famous Uganda problem came up, and he settled them in Argentina in large numbers. Baron de Hirsch was a very wealthy man. He tried the same thing in the United States, where it also, by and large, didn't work out, although there's still a residue of chicken farmers in New Jersey who owe a great deal to Baron de Hirsch. But the Argentina experiment over a period of time failed. There is today, there hasn't been for some time, any large residue of Jewish farmers in Argentina. After their period of indebtedness to the Baron was over, and sometimes even before that, they left their land, sold it very often at reasonably good profits, Argentina having grown in the 10 or 20 years involved that they were required to hold and farm it. They left the little Jewish cities that had grown up around the farms and have moved into the large cities. In the 1930s, when there was a Jewish refugee problem, a similar question was raised. Who was going to let the Jews in? Well, everybody had immigration quotas. The Americans weren't going to let them in. The British let in a great number, but they couldn't let in the thousands that were trying to get out of Germany. No really built up or decently well-organized country would let the Jews in. We sometimes forget what happened in those days. We forget that there was no place for a Jew to go. And the Dominican Republic decided that it would admit a substantial number of Jews to help build up the Dominican Republic's economy, because the Dominican Republic needed industrious and hard-working citizens, and it felt that the Jews would be a very able lot to do this, particularly in the area of farming. And again, a whole group of Jews were brought in and settled in a rural area by themselves, more or less given some indoctrination of the land, so on and so forth. It failed. The Dominican Republic's effort, a very charitable one at the time, failed. I point this out because again and again the suggestion has been made, why do they have to go to Palestine? They have to go to Palestine for two reasons. One, that's where they want to go. Either to the great industrialized, highly developed countries like the United States or England, France occasionally, the United States particularly. Or they want to go to Palestine. There is such a thing as the will of the people. And secondly, the efforts which were made to settle Jews in other areas simply didn't work out. Now, this was one alternative to Zionism, therefore, which had the same aims and same efforts and same interests as Zionism, that didn't work out. But there is another point of view which is somewhat similar to it, which has had a kind of a different history, and which I think merits a little more attention. And this is the point of view, in this case I can give you a specific personality who formulated it and suggested it, and who was its great spokesman, and as a matter of fact probably its only spokesman until relatively modern times. And this was the Eastern European Jewish historian Simon Dubnow, D-U-B-N-O-W. Dubnow had another theory. His theory was one of Jewish cultural autonomy. It is a major alternative to the Zionist thesis. It is a thesis which still has some merit and which we ought to track down. Now, in order to explain how Dubnow thought about Jewish life in modern times, it's important that I tell you something about his background. Dubnow was born of a rather illustrious Jewish family which traced its way back to many distinguished Jewish rabbis and authors and the like. He had a grandfather who was the dominant influence in his early life, who was a highly ethical and deeply scholarly, mystical, pietistic man. And the boy spent much of his early life studying with his grandfather and learning from his grandfather a devotion to study and Jewish things, a love of Jewish things which stayed with him all his life. He was born, therefore, into a very strictly traditional Jewish household, and he received a strictly traditional Jewish education, which meant that he was already well immersed in the Talmud and other volumes when, at the age of 9, he came across his first Haskalah pamphlet. He suddenly discovered something about the outside world, and he began to read and read and read and read. He went through this kind of spiritual awakening that so many people did. He read, for example, that famous novel of Mapu, the Ayat Savua, I think it is. This famous novel of biblical life. And he had just a tremendous world opened up to him. He had an opportunity all of a sudden to see that there was such a thing as passion and love and nature and sunsets and sunrise and all the rest. And then from this he progressed on until he found a world history, a Russian history, and he learned a little Russian. He got involved in Russian literature, a love that he retained all his life. And then he finally, in his later years, began to study foreign languages until he was a master of English and French and the classical languages as well. And he began to read Comte, whose positivism and whose whole notion of the analysis of society in scientific, objective terms, without bringing in any mystical or religious or theological factors, became a positive influence of his life. And John Stuart Mill, the British philosopher whose essay on liberty remained the dominant influence through his life. It was a way of looking at the association of people, a way of looking at the ideals which men have before them. Now, if you start with the Bible and you end up with Auguste Comte, who started the religion of reason, you may recall, and John Stuart Mill, you begin with something which is almost medieval in its religious nature, and you wind up with something which is, or what shall I say, modern, scientific, but anything but religious, anti-religious, almost atheistic. Now this is what happened to him. And you can imagine the scene when the young man at his bar mitzvah, he was only 13, refused to give a speech that they suggested that he give because they wanted him to talk about, to give a certain kind of pilpulistic lecture, which, as I recall, had something to do with tzitzis. I don't recall exactly what it was. It had something to do with some ritual observance, and he wouldn't have anything to do with it. And then later, when as a young man he had come home from finishing the gymnasium, he never quite made it into college. He taught himself for various reasons. When he came home and one Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, he wouldn't even go to shul on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Now everybody went to shul on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Even people who didn't believe. Just want you to know nothing has changed. But he didn't go. His father was the great rabbi of town. But the scholarliness, the devotion, stayed with him all his life. Now somewhere between his 20s and his 30s, he, as a young man who had gotten interested in just about everything that a modern intellectual young man could get interested in, came to realize that if he kept up this way, studying everything and reading everything and loving everything and being excited about everything, he'd never get anywhere. And he decided to limit himself to a specific field, and that specific field, he said, was Jewish history. Primarily the Jewish history of Eastern Europe, but eventually the Jewish history of the Jewish people seen in a world context. A universal Jewish history. And this is what he gave his life to. Now what kind of history was this? The great Heinrich Gretz, the German historian, had gone before him. And he picked up where Gretz left off, except that he wanted to improve on him, because having learned from the modern sociological point of view, which was objective and was interested in social movements and economic trends and political structures and the rest, he was going to write a social and political kind of history. He was not interested just in the great personalities or the great religious movements. He was interested in what happened to individuals in their daily lives, in the way that society functioned, in the classes and the groups. His history was a new kind of Jewish history. It was a Jewish history which reached into the lives of the common people and included the lives of the common people as being historically worthwhile. So as a result, he spent a great deal of his life doing research into the most ordinary kinds of things. How was the Jewish community set up? How did it function? What was the way it carried out its activities? And since Gretz had almost made believe that there was no East European history worthy of note, one of the things that he wanted to do was to demonstrate that Eastern European Jewry also had a history. And he issued a famous call to the Jews of Eastern Europe to start gathering the raw materials of an Eastern European Jewish history. He finally did write a little 3-volume history of the Jews of Russia and Poland, which was published in English by the Jewish Publication Society. But the major thing that he had hoped to do someday, he never got a chance to do, namely to write a history of the Jews of Russia. He never got a chance to do quite that in the way that he had planned to do it. But he did get to complete his magnum opus, a 10-volume work called A Universal History of the Jewish People. It exists in German and in Hebrew, and I believe has been translated into a couple of other languages. Only in English it does not exist. Probably never will exist in English for very many reasons. One of them has been that his disciples, many of them now are in the United States, and Selo Baron, who has written A Social and Religious History of the Jews, is a chief Dubnow disciple and writes history in pretty much the same way. And he is already in the middle of volume 9 of his latest edition of his history, and it will probably go on to 12 or 15. Since this now brings up to date much of what Dubnow did and takes it forward, it's a little difficult to believe that anyone will ever translate the great Dubnow work. Dubnow lived in Eastern Europe. He spent some of the most significant years of his life in St. Petersburg, then down in Odessa. In Odessa, he was part of a group that included Nebuch, Achad Ha'am, and Chaim Nachman Bialik, and Rav Nitsky, and Dizengoff, later the mayor of Tel Aviv, and many of the great Jewish intellectuals of that time. He lived there for 12 or 13 years. One might say, as many a person has done, that the mild climate is a good way to describe the kind of life that he had at that time. It was almost the summer of his life, the best years. Then after that, when the Russian Revolution came, he left Odessa and moved from Odessa to Riga, and then from Riga he moved to Vilna, from Vilna to Riga. He couldn't quite bring himself out of the Eastern European milieu. His friends begged him to come either to the United States as Hitler came into power, or begged him to go to Israel. And it's interesting that he couldn't leave. As one reads the letters he wrote to his friends, it's true he was an old man in his 70s and his 80s, in the 30s and in the early 40s. But as one reads the letters, one sees that it's not just the fact that he couldn't travel. After all, the transportation wasn't quite so bad at the end of the 30s. It isn't quite just the fact that he has children located in that part of Europe. It's apparently the fact that this is his life and this is his place. He couldn't feel himself at home in any other part of the world. And so as a result, he was in the community of Riga when it was overtaken by the Nazis. And while he was saved and preserved for a while as a man in his early 80s, he was part of the first so-called action, is the word by which it was described, in which the Jews of that territory were rounded up and taken to a concentration camp for eventual annihilation. In his particular case, according to the eyewitness accounts, which differ somewhat, notice there are eyewitness accounts, This is all part of the Dubnow notion. Everything should be written down and records should be kept. That's why we have records of what was going on in the ghettos and in the concentration camps, because all these Dubnow disciples were doing historical work in these very ghettos and camps. The reason that we have these personal memoirs and the records of the committees and all that meant is because they were doing what Dubnow said: the history of his people has to be written and recorded. Well, according to the eyewitness accounts which have come to us, he was on his way out to the bus. He apparently had a high fever, and he was not moving along as quickly as the guards wanted, so either he was knocked down or he fell down, and one of the Latvian guards who couldn't put up with him shot him. And he was buried, at least in the Jewish cemetery of Riga. It's a somewhat ignominious end for one of the great Jewish historians of the 20th century. And while still sad, I think we need to be reminded once in a while. So if you don't mind, I will remind you. Now, Dubnow's theory, which I have not discussed yet, comes out of his life and his milieu. Comes out of his mentality, comes out of his approach to the world around him. In the first place, he was not a radical. Anything radical he disagreed with. So that as a result, socialism was not his way. Reform was not his way. Zionism was not his way. He rejected all three as too radical. Socialism, particularly in its revolutionary aspects, he felt could never really be a historical movement. Because while certain revolutions are possible, the real way that people change and develop is over a period of time. And besides which, socialism was a way out of Judaism. And he believed in the Jewish people, as we shall see. He believed in the Jewish people enough to reject the Reform religious answer. He rejected the Reform religious answer as being untrue to the national aspect of Jewish life. By national aspect, he meant that while religion was an important part of that national life, which is in itself a great admission, you must admit, for a person who was not going to define Judaism in a religious way. How many Zionists did one have who were leading thinkers who were willing to admit that religion could play any meaningful role in the development of the Jewish nation? No, he said that religion was one of the most important parts of being a Jew, and that while he couldn't be religious in the way that his ancestors could, nonetheless he thought religion had a very definite role to play in Jewish religious life. It's interesting that at one point in his career, he wanted to be a Jewish religious reformer. He actually wrote that he did believe in certain religious ideals and certain religious spirit in relationship to Judaism, but that he didn't like the form in which Judaism was practiced. But as he read more and got a broader contact with the science of his day, he gave that up. It would have been very interesting to see what would have happened to a religious reformer in Eastern and Central Europe, but he gave it up and went the way that his culture made more logical for him. It's exactly this spirit of acceptance yet rejection of the Reform point of view which makes him reject the Zionist point of view. Why? Because in the first place, he says the Zionist definition of what it means to be a Jew is wrong. That is to say, to be a Jew means not just to belong to a nation, but to belong to a nation of a certain kind. Here it's almost as if we hear Achad Ha'am talking again. The Jewish nation is a nation of a certain kind. Now, while it's a little unfair, I'll contrast him with Klatskin. Klatskin says a nation is land and language. Achad Ha'am says yes in a kind of a... Dubnow says yes in a kind of a primitive way. You mustn't look at it that way. There are three kinds of nationality. There is first the tribal nation, which is fairly obvious. You have small, compact little groups with their national existence, and there they are. And then you have this land and the language kind of nation, which settles and becomes a rather broader kind of thing, and very often takes in many other smaller peoples to live among it. But the highest kind of nation is a nation which is no longer a nation tied to its land, but which is a spiritual nation. A spiritual nation. A nation which is a nation, but which is as yet tied together by the ties of the spirit. There is something about its character which develops over a period of time. There is something about its style of life, about its way of looking at the world, about its way of looking at other people who are part of the nation, which makes it not just a nation by virtue of having a geography, but by virtue of having a point of view and an attitude. And the Jewish people is the first to reach this stage. The Jewish people is the first people to have become a spiritual nation. Therefore, Zionism is retrograde. To say that all Jews must go back to the state, to the land of Israel, or not be Jews, is to take us back and to reduce us for the great accomplishment which we have made. The magnificent thing about the Jewish tradition is we finally learned to be a nation not just of geography, but of the spirit, of the great activities of the human soul, culture, and language. And now you want to take us back and limit us to a land. How terrible. Thus, says Dubnow, the great sin of Zionism is its doctrine of the eternal damnation of those outside the land. Now, I'm making a kind of a pun on certain kinds of Christianity in which, if you're not a Christian, you can't be saved. So that in Zionism, if you're not in the land of Israel, you can't be saved. You are doomed. He says, so why are you taking the majority of the Jewish people and sending them to perdition? Why? What's the matter? Don't you like Jews? They're Jews. How can you take the whole diaspora, millions of people, and say these people aren't Jews and they can't be Jews and they're no good? How can you do a thing like that? They're Jews. They have Jewish languages, all right, so they don't talk Hebrew. So they talk Yiddish, and maybe Yiddish isn't as good as Hebrew, but it's a Jewish language. And there are works of art, and there's literature, and there's science, there's Jewish history. You can't just negate the diaspora. To negate the diaspora is to cut off the body for the sake of preserving the ear, or the nose, or the little finger. How can you do a thing like that? You have to really negate the Jewish nation if you're going to negate the diaspora. So he says, it's true that Zionism is a useful part, and the state of Israel could be a helpful part. A Jewish state could be a helpful part. Didn't live to see the state of Israel. It's all very good, but this is also not a good definition. History leads us to something new. And mind you, he talks with the weight of a historian who has studied cultures. What is happening in our time, he says? It used to be that you had a nation, there was a piece of geography, and there was one people. If it was a German nation, there were Germans and they spoke German. But what happens? It doesn't exist anymore. There is no pure nation anymore. Every nation consists of groups of nations. There are Frenchmen in Germany, and there are Germans in Czechoslovakia, and you have Serbs and Croats in Yugoslavia. And in the United States, of all places, you've got the United Nations. Everybody's there. And that's what's going to happen. Even without modern transportation, even without modern economic opportunities, every nation has to consist of separate nations within the nation. And, he said, this is not only what's going to happen, it's good that it should happen. This is the way to build cosmopolitanism. This is the way to build the equality of mankind. To not only have these groups, but to encourage them. And this is what his point of view was. His point of view was that what Jews should strive for was autonomous rights as a cultural entity within the larger nation as a whole. Cultural autonomy. The right to preserve the national patterns. Now, in Eastern and Central Europe, many of the states allowed the minority groups with government funds to have their own schools, with their own language, with their own internal governmental structures, and the like. This, says Dubnow, is not only what history is bringing to bear, it will preserve Jewish life. You'll be able to have the kind of Jewish community activity which has come down through the centuries. You'll be able to have the full gamut of Jewish life, Religion? Of course religion. But culture and art and literature and language, we'll be able to teach and preserve our own language in this way. And we won't have to give up the diaspora. We can stay there. And then he added a critical argument, which most people had forgotten. Namely, one of the things that Dubnow had been most interested in studying during his researches was the way in which Jews had had their own autonomous cultural and communal institutions in Eastern Europe. The Jews had had their community councils that ruled Jewish life, and the community councils were drawn together in a great national council. There was even at one time the Council of the Four Lands, which exerted a control over Jewish life over the entire heartland of Central Europe. And he had researched in these things. He published the minute books of some of these larger community organizations. So what he was saying was, what does history teach us? One, that there can be such thing as Jewish cultural autonomy, and two, as nations develop and grow, there will be more and more need for this kind of thing. Thus he affirmed the diaspora in a non-religious way, which made religion possible, and which would have given a very interesting non-Zionist, non-religious answer to what it means to be a Jew. To me, a Jew, according to Dubnow, means to participate in a culturally autonomous Jewish community. Now it's interesting to see what happened to this. There was a whole party, a Volkspartei, which was founded to carry on the Dubnow point of view, and it was quite active in Europe. It exerted a considerable influence, particularly after the end of World War I, when, with the combined pressure of the American and the British and the French Jews, into the treaties which were signed with some of the smaller Balkan states, Bulgaria and Romania, there were formally written in the peace treaties guarantees of Jewish minority rights. I believe there were Jewish minority rights granted in Poland as well. And then it became an accepted principle of Eastern and Central European right, guaranteed by international law, that the Jews should have these communally autonomous rights. And what happened? What happened was they never got them. From the Zionist point of view, this was a complete vindication of the meaninglessness of Dubnow's theory. Because Dubnow's theory was based upon the willingness of the European governments to give the Jews rights. And what had been that basic Zionist thesis? They won't give you the rights, and if they give you the rights, they'll take them away. They can't last. The only way to get rights is auto-emancipation. You emancipate yourself, give yourself the rights in your own land. The Bulgarians and the Romanians took them back, and the Poles weren't much better. The Jews never did get the kind of autonomy and individual community action on a Jewish basis that they require. Their schools were whittled away, the funds were taken away, the numerus clausus was introduced in the university, Jewish rights were a joke. Dubnow's theory was shattered, in effect, by the events that happened after World War I, although Dubnow always remained hopeful that the governments could yet be induced to do this. He was a great believer in the need to educate the European governments. Now, what about in the United States? What about the establishment of a Jewish cultural autonomy in the United States? Well, the problem is, what does that mean? If it means, as it seems to mean, setting ourselves up as a separate national entity, as in the early days of immigration the Norwegians did, the Italians did and still do in some part, as the Chinese do, if that's what it means, and if this is the basis upon which it should be carried out, particularly remember the key note here, that the culturally autonomous community should have its own schools and teach in its own language. I am afraid, despite the advocacy of this point of view, by a number of people who would prefer to be a Jew by virtue of belonging to a separate community, a community with its own culture. The idea will not appeal for very long to most American Jews. It's a great idea to talk about Jewish culture. I'm going to be a Jew by Jewish culture. And as we shall see, this is the major answer to the religious point of view in the Western world. I want to be religious, but I want to be a Jew. Those who want to be religious, let them be religious. I want to be a Jew by Jewish culture. Now, Dubnow gave a clear answer to that. Yes, you create Jewish culture as an auxiliary culture. Your democracy approves of that. But in order to have a rich cultural life, you create an autonomous cultural enclave. I believe this is a price most Americans would not be willing to pay. And when it comes down to having separate Jewish schools, while it is true that we have an increasing number of Jewish all-day schools, one is not allowed in Jewish educational circles to call them parochial schools, while there's an increasing number of Jewish all-day schools, this could not be the answer for the majority of the Jewish community, nor even for the culturally determining element in it. How nice it would have been if there had been another alternative. I mean, for the breadth and the variety of Jewish life, it would have been very helpful to those people who can't find themselves religious if there were a major cultural antithesis toward the religious answer of what it means to be a Jew in modern times. But by and large, I don't think the answer has worked out. And by and large, I believe, and that is why we shall be spending most of our time on it from now on, what it means to be a Jew in the Western world culturally has more and more been connected with Jewish religion. Jewish cultural activities have been, by and large, more and more carried out through synagogues and congregations. Under these auspices, I guess I should say something about Jewish community centers. But Jewish community centers seem to find it somehow difficult to carry on Jewish life without again and again referring to the Jewish religious backgrounds of Jewish life. There is some debate on this point. I wouldn't want to indicate that the matter had been finally settled. But I don't see how it would be possible to have a viable Jewish culture in the diaspora without something like Dubnow spoke about. And something like Dubnow spoke about, I do not think we are going to see. Well, I'm sorry I've left you very little time for questions, but we still have a little time. One is not really required to applaud. You're only required to come back next week. Yes, that's not required either, but it would be pleasant. Yes.
This legacy is not necessarily a lecture. I just curious to know from what Hasidic yeshiva did you graduate, who seemed to know the melody of the Talmud Western Reform Rabbi.
Sorry, I have never been in a yeshiva, and I am not of a Hasidic family. As far back as I can trace it, my family is Misnagdish, of all things. But like Simon Dubnow, everything that appeals to Jews appeals to me, and it's remarkable how many Jews have never been in a yeshiva who, at the slight intonation of this melody, will personally identify with it. Besides which, I think it's rather ridiculous that just because it's been the habit of Western philosophers not to sing while they think, that we Jews have given up a very valuable habit, namely using the music to make clear the intellectual patterns. It's very helpful when you think to chant. It really is. Yes?
Well, how wise the Russian Jews were to reject Uganda. As we see today, it really wasn't up to the British. The British didn't have it to give. The British are losing everything, and today they would have had to get out of Africa.
Well, but supposing the Jews were there holding down the colony for them.
Doesn't make any difference.
Well, but don't you see but don't you see what would have happened? As from the British point of view, they would have gained a white settlement in Africa that would have been very much dependent on the British, and if there was trouble in Africa, so the Jews could worry about it, you see.
Yes, the Jews would have to get out.
Get out is another question. This would be very interesting whether the Jews who have managed for a whole series of reasons to establish such very friendly relationships with the Ghanans the people of Ghana might not have been able to somehow sympathize with, well, I don't know, this is a big if, but you know, someone might argue the same thing about the state of Israel. The Arabs will eventually chase them out of there too, but this we won't get into either. Yes?
You said that the all-day school must not be called parochial school.
I said that in Jewish educational circles, it is not considered appropriate to call a, now what shall I call it? To call a Jewish school which a child attends as a substitute for the public school system all day long. How's that? One may not call such a school a parochial school. The technical reason given is that a parochial school really means a parish school, and Jews do not have parish schools. And the real reason is that parochial has the connotation of narrow, confined, restricted, and not all-embracing. And no Jew would admit that any school of his wasn't really as fully democratic, universal, humanistic, and the like, and therefore we do not, one may not in Jewish educational circles refer to these schools as parochial. One has to refer to them in order to get along with one's fellow Jewish educators as all-day schools. Yes, go ahead.
Do the Jews have any high schools or colleges as such?
It's interesting. There are certain Jewish all-day high schools, a few of them. The only Jewish colleges which exist are a very interesting pair. There is a Jewish college which exists for the benefit of all mankind. There is a Jewish-sponsored, non-denominational university, which privately the Jews consider a Jewish school, but they don't want to tell anybody, as if everybody doesn't know. And since Brandeis doesn't discriminate, one can't really find out how many Jews there are at Brandeis University, because if you asked on the application blank what their religion was, this would be discrimination already. But by and large, everybody is pretty much willing to admit privately that there is an unusually healthy predominance of Semitic types on the campus. The other Jewish university is Yeshiva University, which has gradually been expanding from what at one time was a higher school of mathematics and an all-day high school and a rabbinical school and several other connected schools, until it has now a graduate school of education and a school of medicine, and is gradually expanding into the role of a regular university. Now, this is a university which is not only Jewish-sponsored, but operates as a Jewish institution. That is to say, certain Jewish criteria, both of learning and behavior, are set as the standards, although there is academic freedom, which means that university professors on the Yeshiva University faculty who do not teach religious subjects are permitted to have their own personal point of view with regard to the appropriate observance of the Jewish religion. But these are the only two higher institutions of Jewish learning that may nearly be called universities.
Well, isn't Yeshiva non-Zionist?
Yes, but it's not just a rabbinical school. It's a collection of colleges, as all great universities are. Yes?
Did you define what you said that the attendance of a child in all-day school, what I'm going to call parochial education, would keep the child from experiencing the full American life that other children do that go to other schools?
Well, it depends how vital you think the public school system is to the American way of life. This is the basic argument among the Jewish educators. The great advantage in sending a child to an all-day school is that he can learn Hebrew, and he really can. The great disadvantage of sending a Jewish child to an all-day school is that if it is true that children tend to take their friends and make their friends from the people that they go to school with, which seems to be fairly true, then Jewish children going to all-day schools have less likelihood than Jewish children going to public schools to be exposed to that great American institution in which children mix and mingle without regard to race, religion or color, and we should hope over a period of time mix a little more even than they do now. Now that may not be true in New York, where great numbers of Jews live in neighborhoods and sometimes predominate in various schools. But if we begin to have, as there may be, a mixture of races, even in the New York school system, it would be possible for most children in the New York school system to have the democratic experience of mixing with children of different races and religions. Now, this is the basic argument. You see, I went to a high school in which there were 47% Negro students and about 1% Jewish students. So I have had the interesting experience of being both in Golos and in an integrated school. And I found it a very valuable democratic experience for myself. Well, if I had been in a Jewish all-day school, I think I would have missed something, even though I didn't learn as much Hebrew as a child as I should. Yes, I'll make the next answers brief. Yes?
I'm mistaken, didn't Napoleon already have the idea to settle the Jews somewhere in the south of Europe?
Who?
Napoleon. I think he had a plan.
I don't recall any special plan of resettlement of the Jews. Well, we'll have to look into it. I just don't remember it offhand. There are other resettlement plans, I know.
I know it failed, but I think...
Yeah, maybe there was such a one that I don't happen to recall. There was one, for example, to take the Jews out of New York City and bring them into Galveston. Have I mentioned that Jacob Schiff and Henry Cohen got together to divert this huge flow of refugees from New York into Galveston, which was a major port in Texas at the time, but it never got very far. A few thousand Jews came in, and it never amounted to very much. One last question.
I can understand why he would feel sore at the extreme propaganda line of the Zionists regarding the Galut. But Ahad didn't have that position. Did he ever have that?
Well, he and Ahad Ha'am had a very interesting exchange of letters on the negation of the diaspora. They both agreed that it might be possible to have a diaspora life, only they stressed certain differing factors. Ahad Ha'am stressed the dependency, almost, of the Galut communities upon the spiritual center in Palestine. They were to be the circumference of which Palestine was to be the center. And that was because Ahad Ha'am's understanding of Jewish life took in a certain national aspect with regard to land, which Dubnow's didn't. Dubnow said, yes, a Jewish community in Palestine can be very helpful, but it must be true to the spiritual nature of the Jewish people, you see. But anywhere you could have a cultural autonomous group, anywhere you could have it, you'd have just as much a center as any place else. You could fulfill it just as much there as you could in the land of Palestine.
Was he maintaining that line after he was at the Russian Revolution?
Yes, he maintained that line until his death. That's one of the reasons he wouldn't leave. He said, how can we deprive the diaspora of the few creative spirits who are here to give it leadership? The diaspora needs every man, he said, to help it out. And this was one of the reasons he gave for not leaving. There's a very interesting book on Dubnow by Pinson, P-I-N-S-O-N, who is a teacher here at Queen's College, I believe. Koppel Pinson has just edited a series of essays and letters by Dubnow on Jewish nationalism and history. And this is a very interesting man. He's a peripheral man in some respects because he's had no major followers except in the fields of history and sociology, where almost everyone is indebted to him. On the other hand, the answer that he gives was the one major alternative given to either religion or Zionism, but one which I don't think will hold. Well, next week I think we will go back to religion, and I shall see you then.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.